All right, if you have your Bibles, turn to Micah chapter 4. Micah chapter 4. A few weeks ago, we began this series called What is Good? We're looking at the prophecy of Micah, the vision that Micah had, that God had given to him to proclaim to the nation of Israel. Just for some historical context, if you're unaware, this is happening hundreds of years before Jesus comes into the world. This is during a time in the national history of Israel where they have had generations of kings come and go. They have gone through a division within their own nation between the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, each with their kind of ruling classes. They have experienced times when they more closely followed after the ways of the Lord, but more often than not, went astray from the ways of the Lord. And this was all kind of building up toward ultimately a judgment that God was going to pass on to his people. And that judgment was going to eventually manifest in their being captivated by an outside empire, many of them removed from their ancestral homeland and taken away into exile, until which time they were permitted to return. And so Micah is speaking into this, looking at the condition of his nation, the status of the waywardness of the people that he is living among. And he has found that they have very, very much gone astray. And so God has a word for them. And we are looking at that word and pulling out from that, hopefully, a deepening understanding of, like, what is it that God calls good, right? That comes out of Micah later on. We'll get to that in just a couple of weeks, where Micah says, he's shown you what is good and what the Lord requires of you, right? Like he has given us the blueprint for what a flourishing society looks like. And Israel, in so many different ways, twisted and perverted that. Now, by way of introduction this morning, I just wanted to kind of point out that every generation that comes into the world wants a better world, right? And many of us from, generations that are maybe growing a little bit older, many of us want a better world for the generations that are coming up behind us. The problem is that there isn't anything near universal agreement on what is wrong with the world, right? We don't agree on that. We don't agree on what is it that's holding us back. What is it that's keeping the world from flourishing, like in every part and in every place? For some people, they'd say, it's ignorance, right? Whether they're speaking to specifically what's going on within their country or throughout the world. It's like, well, ignorance is the problem. If people were just less ignorant, then we'd all get along much better. Some people would claim that it's oppression, right? That there are these power systems and powerful people that are exerting their power over those who are weaker. Some would say it's inequality, the fact that there's just not an equal kind of status and dignity among all people. Some would say it's a lack of freedom, right? That we have, in some places, practices that restrict and limit the freedoms that people enjoy. Some people would say it's the institutions that we have that are weak and often corrupt, that are creating all kinds of problems for the world. Some would say, hey, the biggest problem we have in the world is what we're doing to the environment. It's the environmental destruction. It's the way that we are exploiting and abusing the resources of this world. And we're not going to be around for much longer if we keep doing that. For some, they'd say it's the decay of culture. Like I have just watched over the course of my lifetime, my culture just kind of like decay and decay and decay until it has become completely unrecognizable from what it was before. And so we don't agree. We don't agree on what's wrong with the world. And we also can't agree on what are the levers that need to be pulled in order to bring about the change that we need. We all recognize that change is necessary, but we don't agree on what are the levers that need to be pulled to bring those changes about. That is, if we were to think about the various values that we could hold, well, which values should get the most attention? Because sometimes those values actually come in conflict with one another. For instance, we might hold the values of liberty and equality. And it might be easy or simple or simplistic to think that, well, liberty and equality, I mean, these are just two things that go hand in hand with one another. But if you actually think about it, liberty and equality sometimes stand in conflict with each other. Right, that for one person to have absolute free liberty to do whatever they please, that can affect whether or not other people are experiencing equality. And conversely, for governments or for people to intervene in order to force a kind of equality, that is, of course, going to restrict liberty. There is the values of tradition and the value of technological progress. Both, I think, wonderful things. But which is the one that we're going to value more? I mean, we are a society that is built on innovation. We are built on progress. We are built on full steam ahead. What's the next thing that we can discover? What's the next thing we can do? What's the next thing that's going to make our lives all better? We love progress. How many of you know that there's a cost that comes along with progress? And sometimes the traditions that we have left behind have actually left us worse off. And so what is it? Are we going to value tradition or technological progress more than the other when they're in conflict? And so that leaves us with competing worldviews. And again, this should be no surprise to any of us that there are lots of worldviews out there, and they compete with one another, and they create a kind of tension, right? A tension that you have probably experienced as your worldview has clashed with the worldview of someone else. Now, worldviews, there are many, and they could probably be categorized into, a handful of buckets. A couple of those buckets would be worldviews that are individualistic and worldviews that are collective. And so the question is, well, what's the best future? Is the best future built by empowering free individualism? That is, everybody gets to do whatever they want with no restrictions other than, well, don't hurt or affect the personal liberties of someone else? Or is the best future built by strengthening communities and through collective action? There are the buckets of tradition and progress. Do we find answers in radical innovation? Did you know that obviously with the emergence of artificial intelligence and the pace at which technology is advancing, I mean, there is a future where the science fiction cyborg might become a reality. Some people in here, I imagine, that have had a hip replaced, and you're already halfway there to cyborg status, right? But and so do we value progress or do we value tradition? Are we going to find the answers for all of the problems of the world in innovation, or do we find them in the restoring of the ancient wisdom that once ruled and governed societies? There's the question of whether our emphasis should be on the local populace or on globalism. That is, are solutions found in national and community sovereignty? Like, hey, each nation needs to carefully regard what is in its own best interests? Or are we better off as a world when we cooperate globally? There's the buckets of material versus spiritual. What's the goal? What's the goal of life? Is the goal for us to have material abundance? Like that is, we can get as much as we possibly can, that we can live for as long as we can, right? And so we have material abundance and longevity. Or is it a more spiritual priority founded on such things as the moral life, of cultural goodness, and of spiritual renewal? There is, of course, the question of the priority of humanity versus the priority of the planet, right? And so you have those who would say that human beings are not as special as the Christian worldview would suggest that human beings are. And so the focus shouldn't be on human welfare as such, but more on, like, what are we doing to the biosphere? Because the world's going to be around, for many, many millions of years longer than human beings will be. And then there's the question related to that of growth and sustainability. Hey, do we need more stuff? Or do we need to learn how to live with less, right? And so, again, like all different kinds of worldviews come into play and find themselves in conflict with one another. In Micah chapter 4, we're going to find a vision that God has for the world. A vision that he was going to bring about. Now, these first 3 chapters that we've gone through have been some pretty doom and gloom, have they not? Right? Because God is like bringing Israel to account for the ways that they have corrupted justice, for the ways that they have perverted the commands of God, for the ways that they have gone away from the ideal that God had established. But now, even in the midst of their being judged for their wrongdoing, God has a vision for what will come. Let's read it together. Micah chapter 4, starting in verse 1. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established at the top of the mountains and will be raised above the hills. Peoples will stream to it. And many nations will come and say, "Come, let's go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the house of God of Jacob. He will teach us about his ways, so we may walk in his paths. For instruction will go out of Zion, and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He, that is the Lord, will settle disputes among many peoples and provide arbitration for strong nations that are far away. They, the nations, will beat their swords into plows and their spears into pruning knives. Nation will not take up the sword against nation, and they will never again train for war. But, verse 4, but each person will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. Though all the peoples walk in the name of their own gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. On that day, this is the Lord's declaration: I will assemble the lame and gather the scattered, those I have injured. I will make the lame into a remnant, those far removed into a strong nation, and then the Lord will reign over them in Mount Zion from this time on and forever. And you, watchtower for the flock, fortified hill of daughter Zion, the former rule will come to you, sovereignty will come to daughter Jerusalem. So the mountain of the house of the Lord, here in verse 1, is described to be established as the highest of the mountains and lifted up above all of the hills. Now, In Micah's day, mountains represented the presence of a people's God, right? Their deity. And it represented that God's rule over the territory it oversees. It was seen as, the mountain that is, as a kind of gateway to heaven. And so Micah is using the symbol of the mountain here to describe the ascent of Yahweh. Yahweh is the personal name for God, right? We translate it as I am. And this God, Yahweh, is described as ascending over and above the deities of all the other nations, with the idea that the mountain of God would become front and center, it would become the most conspicuous place to all the peoples of the world. Now, what's surprising is what Micah says about the nations. Right? Of course, Micah is, talking directly to the nation of Israel. But here in chapter 4, he speaks of the nations. At this time, and for all of Israel's history, other nations have been a problem. Like you read through the history of Israel, right? Whether it was in their conquest of the promised land, in the wars and the battles that followed, right? You read through these conflicts that they engaged in with surrounding nations. Other nations were a problem. There were some nations that directly opposed Israel. There were some nations that, sometimes they were enemies, and sometimes they got entangled in fragile alliances with Israel. But other nations were always considered as other, as outsiders. Outsiders that were categorically inferior to Israel in every way. It was a lot less like today, where you could take somebody who's in a technologically advanced and economically prosperous country who says, I want to go live in another highly developed country, and they can make that move and find kind of the same levels of opportunity and experience no real drop-off in the quality of life, right? Like that could be true of us. There are other places, I prefer the United States of America as the place where I am going to live, but I also recognize there are other parts of the world that I could go and probably enjoy a very similar quality of life to like I enjoy here. But as far as like the way the nation of Israel saw itself, everything else out there was other than what they were. And Israel had developed a superiority complex. They actually had come to pervert the reason and purpose for why God had especially chosen them. Had God especially chosen them? Absolutely. God had especially chosen and selected for them to be his people, but he did it for a reason. And they abandoned the reason, they abandoned the purpose, and they saw themselves as something different from what they were intended to be. They had come to think that preeminence over all of the other nations was their birthright, that it belonged to them, that it was theirs by virtue of the fact of who they were. Because they had forgotten some of the words that God had spoken to them, like words that God said, like, hey, if you will be faithful to the covenant that we are establishing with one another, then I will protect you. I will provide for you. The land will be a blessing to you and to the generations that follow after you. But if you walk away from the Lord, if you abandon my statutes, if you pervert justice, if you become the oppressor, then the land will spew you out. They forgot that. They thought the land was theirs by virtue of who they were, and that all of the other nations were somewhere way, way down, always looking up at them. This is why Jesus, even in Jesus' day, hundreds of years after this text was written, Jesus has died on the cross. He's risen from the dead. He's there with his disciples. And in Acts chapter 1, Jesus' own disciples come to Jesus and say, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? Because they understood the kingdom preeminence as a birthright that belonged to the nation of Israel. But God had different plans. And we see that here in Micah. In verse 1, we are told that the peoples will flow to the mountain of God. That in verse 2, many nations shall come. And so the first part of the vision is where instead of nations conquering each other, they began seeking God's instruction. Now, this is contrasted with the pilgrimages that were made very commonly among the pagan nations, pagan worshipers, to their pagan gods. For every single nation, for every single place, there was the deity that they worshiped, and there was generally a high place that was established as the center of worship for that religion. And for the people that lived under its jurisdiction, they would make sacred pilgrimages to such a place. And now here what is being described is that Yahweh on the mountain of the Lord was going to attract the peoples of the world. Not only is this pilgrimage contrasted with the pilgrimages made by pagan worshipers in pagan religions, but it's also contrasted with even the pilgrimages that Israel itself would make to the holy city of Jerusalem. Because the people of Israel, some of them came voluntarily and with anticipation to the city of Jerusalem, but others came out of mere compulsion. But here what's being described is the peoples from all over the world coming to where God is with happy anticipation. Now, this is a reversal of history where the Temple Mount, this mountain of the Lord, is no longer going to be an exclusive destination for one nation like it was thought to be by the nation of Israel, but rather a place that gathers people from every nation. And the question would be, well, how is that accomplished? How do you go from having this kind of system of very that's highly exclusive, right? You have this specially called and covenanted nation of Israel, and within that, the borders of that nation, you have the holy city, and within that holy city, you have the temple, and in that temple, you have the most holy place where God's presence is seen to and understood to dwell. How do you move from a place where there is a specific geographic point at which God's presence meets us in this world to something more like what is being described, and that is access for all of the nations of the world? Well, the answer to that is accomplished through Jesus. It's accomplished through Jesus. Jesus completely upends what was the old system. Now, just kind of as a sideline here, I wanted to point out that I think it's an interpretive mistake to treat prophecies like this one, and there are others like this. It's a mistake to make the interpretive decision that these prophecies reach their climax in a national restoration of Israel. There is an entire kind of strain of the study of the last things that would treat such prophecies as this as, hey, we're supposed to be looking forward to and anticipating the restoration of the nation of Israel in a political sense. And the problem I have with that is that to adopt that kind of view would, to me, seem to make the inauguration of the kingdom that Jesus talked about a kind of anticlimax. What I think rather we should interpret the words of Micah and others like him to mean is that the first advent of Jesus, which we celebrate at Christmas with his birth, with his coming into the world, is a fulfillment of the kind of promises like what we find here. Now, what's the promise? Well, the promise is that is being made to Israel of its restoration, but it's not limited to Israel. It includes the rest of the world, and in Jesus, it becomes a fulfillment that's in process. And this is where we find ourselves. We are in the middle of that, right? That God has made this promise of bringing the kingdom of heaven into the world, and that was inaugurated in the life, the ministry, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. It is carried out to this present day by the church, and it anticipates its final consummation in the second advent of Jesus, which we call the second coming or the return of Jesus into this world, at which point the promise will have its full completion. And here's how Jesus accomplishes this, right? If Jesus is the key to understanding how this kingdom order is being established, we need to understand exactly what it is that Jesus came here to do. The first thing Jesus came to do when he came into this world was to mediate the hostility that existed between God and humankind. Now, this is not a dimension of the relationship between God and people that we like to talk about a whole lot. But the reality is, as human beings, our natural state, the state that we are born into this world, is we are enemies of God. Now, that might sound strange to you, especially if all you've ever espoused is this idea that as human beings, we are the children of God. That's not exactly what Scripture teaches us. Paul in Romans chapter 5 described an era in the experience of human beings when we were enemies of God. He says in Colossians chapter 1 that we were alienated and hostile. That there's a hostility that exists between God and humankind that needed to be dealt with. How was that dealt with? Well, it was mediated through the work accomplished by Jesus on the cross. Right? Jesus went to the cross and he took the punishment that belonged to humans upon himself and made possible our salvation. So that's one of the things that Jesus came to do. A second thing that Jesus came to do is he established a way for us to experience peace. Now, what we read in Micah chapter 4 kind of speaks of this day that sounds very idealistic, right? They will beat their swords into plows. They will convert their spears into pruning hooks. Never again shall they learn the art of war. Nations will not war against nations anymore. That sounds like a wonderful time, doesn't it? Especially given all that is going on in the world today and what has been going on in the world for literally all of our lives. And so the question is, well, what does this peace look like? And again, I think it's a mistake. It's an interpretive mistake to think about the peace that God wants to bring into the world as something that is merely reserved for some future thing that doesn't really have anything to do with us right now. Because this is the problem. Again, like if it's all about reversing the climax of God's intervention into this world, which I believe that climax occurred in the advent of Jesus and does not occur in the restoration of a political nation. If we make the mistake of turning that around, we actually lose what it is that we are being called into in building the kingdom of Jesus like we have been commanded to do. So again, back to this idea of Jesus established a way for peace. And here's how he did it. Because listen, I mean, how many of you are always at peace? How how many would suggest that the world is, relatively speaking, at peace? Of course not. So, well, how could you say that peace has been brought into the world by Jesus as he has inaugurated his kingdom in this world? Well, this is how he does it. He does it in the fact that he deprioritized the need for us to build up our own kingdoms in this world. How many of you are building a kingdom in this world? I'll wait. How many of you are building a kingdom in this world? Only my father-in-law. Anybody else? We've got two honest people in the room. All right, Jason, are we not? Like, are you, okay, let me ask it this way. How many of you are making a life for yourself in this world? Okay. You're like, not much of a kingdom. No, it's a kingdom, right? Okay, like some kingdoms look a little bigger and more splendid than others. But the truth is, like, we are all making a life for ourselves in this world. Now, in that making of a life for ourselves in this world, there are things that we bring into varying levels of priorities, like things that we consider to be important. What Jesus did was he deprioritized the need to build up your kingdom in this world. Here's what I mean by that. If this life is all there is, which may not be the way that you think about it, but it is certainly the way that most people in the world think about it, right? If this world is all there is, then we should fight harder for personal property and prosperity, right? You should fight harder for what belongs to you. If this world is all that there is, you should fight harder. I should fight harder for our own personal safety. Again, if this life is all that there is, safety should be one of the most important things, right? Because if I'm not safe, and if my life is unnecessarily cut short, or if something else comes in to disrupt my ability to pursue all that I want from if this life is all there is, I should be fighting hard for my personal safety. You should be fighting really hard to achieve whatever personal ambitions we have, if this life is all there is. But if there's a more enduring kingdom for us to pursue, then all those things become far less important, which means we can actually find peace even without them. When we use the language of having peace despite what circumstances we have, what do we mean by that? Well, we're saying, like, all of the circumstances surrounding our lives would suggest that we should not be at peace, but it is actually possible for a person to have peace even when their circumstances would say that they can't. Why? Because instead of building up our kingdom in this world, there is a deeper concern for the more enduring kingdom that is to come. A wise person in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 10 said, "Whoever loves money never has enough, and whoever loves wealth is never satisfied with their income." That is, if you have fallen in love with wealth, with material gain, if that is the great love of your life, you're going to find yourself never satisfied because you'll never have enough. So there'll be this constant chasing of it, which means you'll never be at peace with what you have, no matter how much of it you have. Paul says in Philippians chapter 4, he said, "I have learned to be content in all circumstances." Now, if you were to list all of the circumstances that Paul found himself in, you'd be very, very happy that many of the things that he went through, you've never had to go through, and you hope to never have to go through. And Paul says, in all circumstances, I have learned to be content. He says in 1 Timothy chapter 6, if we have food and clothing, we will be content with that. Like, how many of you would honestly say, like, if I could literally just check those two boxes, food and clothing, that's all I need, I'm content, I don't need anything else? That'd be a tough one, wouldn't it? Peter says in first chapter of his letter, he describes a future inheritance, that is, an inheritance that we don't receive in this world. He says it is imperishable, it is undefiled, it is unfading, and it is kept in store for those found within Christ's salvation. The point is, Jesus has made a way for us to have peace that says, I can have peace even when my personal safety is in jeopardy. Right? This is the person who stands in the middle of having their life terminated and yet is at peace because this life is not all that there is. Or the person who has not been able to acquire all of the things that they may naturally have been inclined to acquire and are still at peace because there is a more enduring kingdom that they anticipate. Number 3, Jesus inaugurated a new community. He inaugurated a new community. We call it the church. And you know what the church does? Is the church removes the limitation of God's presence being confined to a single place, like in the temple, like on the mountain of the Lord, because God is present wherever his people are. This is why the Great Commission that Jesus leaves for his followers is to go into all of the world, right? The mountain of the Lord as a destination for people from all over to pilgrimage in Micah chapter 4 is an analogy that is actually accomplished not by the literal people getting on airplanes and flying to a place or getting on boats and navigating to a place, or people making the long and treacherous journey to some geographical point on the globe, but rather it is accomplished by the sending out of those who can teach others the ways of the Lord so that they may walk in his paths. And in verses 2 and 3, we see the effect of this educating the nations, which is that the law of God will move beyond where it is currently confined within the kind of the geographic and cultural borders of a single nation, and it will spread throughout the world. And again, this is where we find ourselves. That he is now governing and arbitrating many peoples, that he is one who decides disputes. The need to go to war will vanish entirely. He says that nations at war will need to go to war no more. There'll be no more reason for it. And so radical will this change be that all of the instruments that were once used for war are actually going to be repurposed for something else. And you know what? Micah does not only speak of a world where there is an absence of war, he speaks of a world that is absolutely flourishing. Verse 4, he says, but each person will sit under his grapevine and under his fig tree with no one to frighten him, for the mouth of the Lord of armies has spoken. And you know, this says something about the changed condition of the hearts of people that makes this kind of peace possible. I want you to think about this. Like, what is the source of the disputes that we have in this world, in our lives? Why is it that we sometimes find ourselves needing arbitration to deal with a conflict that we're having with another person or with other people? Or what is it that causes the most violent kind of fighting, like what we see happening in wars? What is the source for all that? I would suggest that it's that as humans, our appetites grow larger and larger with time. I don't mean our appetite for food, although that can grow larger and larger with time. But our appetite, our desires can grow, especially if our appetites are directed toward things, the kinds of things that only satisfy for a moment or two. We find ourselves in a place where we need more, and then we need more and more after that. Here's how he describes. James chapter 4 says, hey, what causes quarrels and what causes fights among you? Is it not this, that your passions are at war within you? Passions are desires. They are these appetites. Verse 2, you desire and do not have, so you murder. You covet and cannot obtain, so you fight and quarrel. You do not have because you do not ask. You ask and do not receive because you are asked wrongly to spend it on your passions. You adulterous people. Do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. See, Micah here, he describes the state of a person sitting under their grapevine and under their fig tree with no one to frighten them. And you know what? You might join me in saying, yeah, that's what I want. Like, what a beautiful picture. Because you can imagine it however you best imagine it. Whether it's like, some farmhouse cottage, with acres and acres of land, right, that you get to just kind of enjoy and have to yourself. Or you can envision it as, I don't know why you do this, but, third-story suite in the middle of the city. Or you could see it as like pick your oasis, pick your fig tree, pick your vine, right? You say, yeah, that's exactly what I want. I want that. I want for that picture to be true in my life. For me to be able to enjoy what's mine without having to worry about someone else trying to take it away from me. George Washington would quote the words, every man his fig tree and every man his vine, to describe an idea of personal liberty where everybody gets to enjoy their own property and the fruit of their own labor without anybody coming to take it away. But I want to be careful that even with this vision of such peace, like we all, I think, want, it'd be bad for us to too quickly pass over the very modest description of what brings that peace and that enjoyment to the person under their fig tree and under their vine. Notice, first of all, what the action is in that verse. Micah chapter 4, verse 4. What is the action? The action of Micah 4:4 is sitting. Sitting. How many of you have ever gotten really far by sitting? How many of you would ever say you've accomplished much by the time you spent on your rump? The action is sitting. And the context of where the sitting is being done is among the basic essentials of life. I mean, how modest of a context can you have than a vine? A fig tree. There is this imagery that I think Micah wants for us to see of contentment with what is needed for daily life. And so what you have here is, on the one hand, the good of a life that is unterrified at the prospect of war and violence. That is, there's nobody who's invading the property of the vine and the fig tree owner. But on the other hand, there is the good that the owner of the vine and the fig tree isn't given to an increasing appetite of needing more vines, of needing more fig trees, of acquiring more property, of building more wealth, of living in the cycle of an increasing appetite that is constantly on the hunt for what one doesn't already have, or for more of what one already has. And here's the truth, I think. And that is that as societies are increasingly filled with people who are given to increasing appetites, we end up with races and competition to acquire the things that are in limited supply. And this will, of course, lead to the conflict like what James talks about, even to the point where we will go to war with one another. And so we're in this interesting position as followers of Jesus where we can both love the idea of peace, and yet we are also contributing to war by how we're prone to living in excess, of constantly on the hunt for more, right? We love progress, but we often fail to see the hidden cost behind the progress that we've observed. And so in verse 5, we'll kind of conclude the teaching here. But Micah says, though all the peoples walk in the name of their own gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. And so let me just point out what may be obvious, what you may have picked up on already, and that is that what we're living in is this certain kind of like state of human history where what Micah was prophesying was fulfilled in Jesus, but it is not yet consummated in that it has come to the end and it is fully done and over with. We live in this state where many have come and are coming to the Lord's house. But there is this grim reality that, hey, not everyone has and not everyone will. That many will continue in their ways and many will continue to follow their own gods. So what are we to do? Well, Micah tells us. Micah says, though all the people walk in the name of their own gods, we will walk in the name of the Lord our God forever and ever. And so here's I think the application that we can make, and I'll frame this with some questions that I think we can ask ourselves. One question would be, does my life look like it is more shaped by the kingdom of God or by the kingdoms of this world? Like, think about that. When it comes to your life, does the shape of your life seem to more reflect the priorities of the kingdom of God or the very ordinary course of things as we find in the kingdoms of this world? Another question we could ask is, am I a person who is cultivating peace or am I fueling conflict? How many of you know that both types of person exist in the world? And if you don't believe me, just log on to Facebook later on today, because you'll find plenty of examples there. Right? What am I doing? Am I cultivating peace? Am I a peacemaker? Am I a person that, again, has been introduced to the kingdom priority of Jesus, which is to bring the peace of heaven into this world, and that even though the wars that nations will rage against one another are going to continue without, I can't stop that. And I can't stop a lot of the very, very bad things that are going on in the world, but what I can do is I can be one who introduces peace into the part of this world that God has placed me. And so what am I doing with that? Am I sowing peace or am I sowing conflict? Because again, we're in this state of fulfilled but not consummated. Fulfilled in the sense that Jesus has come and he has inaugurated his kingdom and he's invited us to participate in it, but not yet consummated in that we still wait for and we still anticipate the return of Jesus when he will finally and fully bring righteousness, justice, equity, love, peace, and joy into this world forever and evermore. We're going to prepare to receive communion. And so let me just say, as we close what we're learning from Micah, that Micah gives us this vision of a coming day when swords will become plowshares, where the wounded are gathered, where justice reigns, where all the nations of the world find their peace under the rule of God. And it's a beautiful picture. This kingdom that God has promised. But the reality is, and this is so important for us to remember, that kingdom is not merely a future dream. It's not a future dream. It's not something that's far off and only for a time and a place that really has nothing to do with us. Because again, it was inaugurated in Jesus. And the peace that Micah foresaw was purchased at the cross. The healing that Micah promised began when Jesus bore our sins and our sorrows. And the hope of that future restoration became certain. It became as good as done when Jesus Christ rose from the dead. And so that brings us to the Lord's table this morning. Because communion it's a remembrance, and it is also a promise, right? We look back and remember the sacrifice through which Jesus made peace with God possible for us. The bread reminds us that his body was broken for us. The cup reminds us that he shed his blood for us, and that through his death, the King, the Messiah, the Christ, he has secured the salvation of his people. But communion doesn't only look back and point backward, it points us forward. Every time we eat the bread, every time we drink the cup, what we're doing, as Paul says, we proclaim the Lord's death until when? Until he comes, until he returns. And we're reminded that the kingdom has begun, but it has not yet come in its fullness. And so we still wait for the day that Micah described, the day when Christ returns, the day when evil is defeated forever, the day when every single wound is healed, and the day when peace fully covers the earth. So as we come to the table today, we come as citizens of that coming kingdom. We come as people who have found peace in Christ. We come as those who are still being restored. We come with hope, knowing that what God has promised, he will surely accomplish. And so let's come with gratitude for what Jesus has done, and with a renewed faith in what he is doing, and with anticipation for what he will yet do as he's making all things